In this episode, we take the next step after identifying and assessing risk by learning how to recommend what should be done about it in a way that other people can understand, support, and defend later. Many new learners assume that risk treatment is simply choosing a control and moving on, but in real architecture work, the recommendation is only valuable if it is grounded in clear reasoning and if the decision can be traced back to the facts that shaped it. When the organization asks why a particular safeguard was chosen, why it was funded, or why it was not, you need an answer that sounds like a disciplined decision rather than a personal preference. This becomes even more important when an incident happens, because the organization will revisit past choices under stress and ask whether the risk was handled responsibly. The goal here is not to memorize a set of treatments, but to learn how to advise options with a rationale that survives review and a traceable decision path that remains readable months or years later. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A risk treatment option is simply a deliberate way the organization chooses to respond to a specific risk, and treating it as deliberate is the first mindset shift beginners need. Risk is never fully eliminated, because every system has some remaining uncertainty and some remaining exposure. So treatment is about reducing risk to a level the organization can live with while still meeting its goals. The common treatment families can be understood as changing the system so the risk is smaller, shifting responsibility for part of the risk to another party, changing the plan so the risk is avoided, or acknowledging the risk and living with it under defined conditions. The architect's role is to present options that match the system context and the organization's constraints rather than presenting a single favorite choice. That does not mean being indecisive, because a strong recommendation often includes a preferred option, but it also includes why other options were considered and why they were not chosen. When you can articulate that comparison calmly, your advice becomes both useful and defensible. Clear rationale starts with being precise about what the risk actually is, because sloppy risk statements lead to sloppy treatments that either overreact or miss the point. A well-formed risk statement identifies what asset could be harmed, what threat or failure could cause harm, what weakness or condition enables it, and what the likely impact would be if it happened. If a risk statement is vague, like we might get hacked, nearly any treatment sounds reasonable and the decision becomes arbitrary. When the risk statement is specific, like unauthorized access to a sensitive dataset through overly broad privileges, you can propose treatments that are clearly connected to the problem. Specificity also helps you avoid treating symptoms instead of causes, such as adding more alerts when the real issue is uncontrolled access. For beginners, this is an important discipline because it prevents you from recommending the most dramatic control when a simpler structural fix would reduce risk more effectively. Good treatment advice begins with the clarity that allows your later reasoning to stay on track. Once the risk is clear, the next step is to determine what outcome would count as improvement, because treatment is not meaningful without a target. Improvement might mean making a harmful event less likely, making the impact smaller, making detection faster, or making recovery safer and quicker. It might also mean strengthening accountability so actions are traceable and misuse becomes harder to hide. In architecture work, you often want outcomes that are measurable or at least observable, such as reducing the number of systems exposed to a threat, limiting privileged actions to a smaller set of roles, or ensuring that critical evidence is captured consistently. Without an outcome target, teams can implement controls that create activity but do not reduce meaningful risk. This is a common beginner trap, where effort is mistaken for progress, especially when the organization is busy and wants visible action. When you define the intended outcome first, you can evaluate each treatment option by asking whether it actually moves the system toward that outcome. That evaluation becomes the foundation of your rationale. Advising options also requires you to understand the organization's constraints, because the best theoretical control is not the best practical control if it cannot be operated or funded. Constraints include time, budget, staffing, complexity tolerance, legacy dependencies, and performance or usability requirements. They also include obligations such as compliance requirements, contractual promises, and the need to maintain service continuity. A treatment that demands a complete redesign might be ideal in a greenfield system, but impossible in a mature environment that cannot tolerate downtime. Similarly, a highly complex control might be strong on paper, but weak in practice if it is too hard for teams to manage consistently. Your job as an architect is not to pretend constraints do not exist, but to incorporate them into the recommendation so the organization can make a realistic decision. This is also where traceability matters, because if a control was not chosen due to a constraint, that reason should be documented so future reviewers understand it was a conscious trade-off. When constraints are captured, decisions feel intentional rather than negligent. With that groundwork, you can present the major treatment families in a way that a beginner can apply to real scenarios. One option is to reduce risk by adding or improving controls, which can include preventive measures like stronger access boundaries, detective measures like better monitoring, and corrective measures like safer recovery capabilities. Another option is to avoid risk by changing the design so the risky condition no longer exists, such as eliminating unnecessary data collection or removing an exposed interface that is not required. A third option is to transfer risk by shifting part of the responsibility through contracts, insurance, or outsourcing, while recognizing that transfer rarely removes the need for oversight and evidence. A fourth option is to accept risk, meaning leadership knowingly agrees to live with the remaining exposure, usually with conditions like monitoring, time limits, or compensating measures. These are not labels you throw around casually, because each has implications for accountability and evidence. Advising well means explaining what each option would look like in system terms and what the ongoing responsibilities would be. A common mistake when recommending risk reduction controls is treating controls as isolated add-ons rather than as design choices that shape how the system behaves. If you recommend stronger access control, for example, that is not just a checkbox, because it changes workflows, account life cycles, support processes, and the ability to investigate misuse. If you recommend encryption, that changes key handling, recovery planning, and the boundaries of trust between components. If you recommend monitoring, that changes data retention, privacy exposure, and operational workload for triage and response. A clear rationale must therefore include how the control works at a high level and what it depends on to remain effective over time. Without that explanation, teams may implement the surface form of a control while missing the supporting pieces that make it real. Decision traceability improves when you document not only the control choice, but the assumptions that make it succeed, such as who will review alerts or who will approve privileged access changes. This kind of reasoning is what separates architecture advice from a list of popular security features. Avoidance is sometimes the smartest option, but beginners often overlook it because it can feel like giving up features rather than improving security. In reality, avoidance can be a powerful design move when a feature creates disproportionate risk relative to its value. If a system collects sensitive data that is not truly needed, removing that collection reduces exposure, reduces compliance burden, and reduces the attack surface of storage and processing components. If an integration point exists primarily for convenience, but creates a wide trust boundary, redesigning the workflow to remove that dependency may be safer and easier to operate. Avoidance is also helpful when controls would be extremely expensive or complex to implement correctly, especially in environments where operational simplicity is crucial. When you recommend avoidance, your rationale should connect the change to business objectives, showing that the organization still meets its goals while reducing unnecessary risk. Traceability matters here too, because future teams might be tempted to reintroduce the avoided feature without understanding why it was removed. A clear record helps prevent the same risky choice from returning quietly. Transfer is another treatment that can be misunderstood, especially by beginners who assume outsourcing a function means outsourcing accountability. Transfer can reduce certain risks, such as operational burden or certain categories of technical exposure, but it does not eliminate the organization's responsibility for outcomes, especially when sensitive data or mission-critical services are involved. When you transfer, you are often transferring part of the operational control and some of the financial consequence, but you still need oversight, requirements, and evidence that the external party is meeting expectations. A clear rationale for transfer includes why the organization believes the other party is better positioned to manage the risk and what contractual or governance measures will ensure the risk does not return in hidden form. It should also include what remains in the organization's scope, such as identity decisions, monitoring at boundaries, or incident response coordination. For decision traceability, it is important to record what evidence will be required from the third party and how it will be reviewed. Without that, transfer becomes a blind spot, which is exactly the opposite of what good architecture intends. Acceptance is often the most emotionally charged option because it can sound like ignoring risk, but responsible acceptance is actually a structured decision with conditions. Organizations accept risk when the cost, complexity, or disruption of further controls outweighs the benefit, or when a risk is temporary and will be addressed later as part of plan changes. The architect's job is to ensure acceptance is informed and documented, not accidental or hidden. That means explaining what could happen, what the impact would be, what controls already exist, and why additional measures are not being pursued right now. It also means recommending compensating measures that reduce the chance that accepted risk becomes a surprise, such as focused monitoring, restricted exposure, or time-bound reviews. Decision traceability is essential for acceptance because the organization must be able to show who accepted the risk and why, especially if the risk later contributes to an incident. A clear acceptance record prevents blame shifting and supports learning because it shows the decision context rather than leaving future reviewers to guess. Clear rationale also depends on comparing options in a consistent way because without a comparison method, the loudest opinion often wins. A useful comparison includes how much each option reduces likelihood and impact, how quickly it can be implemented, how difficult it is to operate reliably, and what secondary risks it introduces. Secondary risks matter because controls can create new weaknesses, such as complex access workflows that lead to unsafe workarounds or heavy monitoring that captures sensitive information unnecessarily. Another comparison factor is durability, meaning whether the option remains effective as the system changes or whether it will require constant rework and exceptions. You also consider alignment with organizational priorities, because a high-availability service may tolerate certain risks differently than a system designed primarily for confidentiality. When you document these comparison factors, your recommendation becomes a reasoned conclusion rather than a personal preference. This is the kind of reasoning the exam often looks for, especially in scenarios where more than one answer seems plausible and the best answer is the one that balances risk reduction with operational reality. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Decision traceability is what allows that rationale to be understood later, and it is best thought of as a story with links rather than a pile of documents. The story begins with the risk statement and the assets at stake, then connects to the assumptions, constraints, and business objectives that shaped the analysis. It continues through the options considered, the trade-offs evaluated, and the chosen treatment, including any compensating measures and evidence expectations. Traceability also includes who approved the decision, because ownership and accountability are part of the decision itself. For architects, the practical goal is that a reviewer should be able to read the decision record and understand what problem was being solved, why the chosen option was selected, and what must be maintained for the choice to remain valid. Beginners often think traceability is only for audits, but it also protects teams during turnover and during incidents, because people can quickly see why the system is the way it is. When traceability exists, the organization can learn and improve instead of repeatedly rediscovering the same context. A frequent beginner pitfall is treating risk treatment as a single moment rather than a life cycle, but treatments often require ongoing verification to remain meaningful. If you choose a control-based treatment, you need to confirm it is operating and not drifting, which means evidence and monitoring must be part of the plan. If you choose avoidance, You need to ensure that avoided features do not reappear through unofficial workarounds or later changes. If you choose transfer, you need ongoing oversight of third-party performance, not a one-time contract signature. If you choose acceptance, you need periodic review to confirm the assumptions still hold and that the risk has not increased due to changes in exposure or threat activity. Architecture recommendations should therefore include how the organization will know the treatment is still working, because that is what makes a treatment durable. This lifecycle mindset keeps decisions from becoming stale and helps avoid the surprise audits where a once-true claim is no longer true. When you design treatment as a maintained capability, you turn risk work into steady governance rather than recurring crisis. Another subtle challenge is communicating risk treatment recommendations to different audiences without losing accuracy, because stakeholders care about different parts of the rationale. Technical teams need to understand what must change in the design, how the change affects workflows, and what evidence must be produced to show the control is operating. Business leaders need to understand what harm is being reduced, what cost or delay is being introduced, and what residual risk remains after the treatment. Compliance and audit stakeholders need to understand how the decision aligns with obligations and what evidence will be available during reviews. The architect must keep the core story consistent while adjusting the framing for each audience, which is why traceability is so valuable. When everyone can point back to the same decision record, disagreements become about facts and trade-offs rather than about competing stories. Beginners sometimes oversimplify for non-technical audiences and accidentally remove key assumptions, which later causes confusion and mistrust. A mature approach is to keep one truthful core narrative and translate it carefully without changing its meaning. To close, advising risk treatment options with clear rationale and decision traceability is about turning risk knowledge into choices that can be implemented, operated, and defended over time. You start with a precise risk statement and a clear target outcome. Then incorporate real constraints so the recommendation is feasible rather than theoretical. You present treatment families as practical options, explaining what each would look like in system terms and what ongoing responsibilities it creates. You build a clear rationale by comparing options consistently, accounting for likelihood, impact, operational burden, and secondary risk, and then recommending the option that best fits the organization's priorities. You preserve decision traceability by recording the story from risk to choice to evidence, including who approved the decision and what assumptions must remain true. Finally, you treat risk treatment as a life cycle, ensuring the organization can verify that the chosen approach still works as systems and threats change. When you practice this discipline, your architecture decisions become more confident, more credible, and far more resilient under audit and incident scrutiny.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.